Lord strong. Jesus, keep me from all wrong. I'll be satisfied as long as I walk, dear Lord, close to thee. Just a closer walk with thee. Granted, Jesus is my plea. Daily walking close to thee. Let it be, dear Lord, let it be. Through this world of toil and snares, if I falter, Lord, who cares? Who with me my burden shares? None but thee, dear Lord, none but thee. Just a closer walk with thee. Granted, Jesus is my plea. Daily walking close to thee. Let it be, dear Lord, let it be. When my feeble life is o'er, time for me will be no more. Guide me gently, safely o'er to thy kingdom shore, to thy shore. Just a closer walk with thee. Granted, Jesus is my plea. Daily walking close to thee. Let it be, dear Lord, let it be. Sing the wondrous love of Jesus, sing his mercy and his grace. In the mansions bright and blessed, he'll prepare for us a place. When we all get to heaven, what a day of rejoicing that will be. When we all see Jesus, we'll sing and shout the victory. While we walk the pilgrim pathway, clouds will overspread the sky. But when traveling days are over, not a shadow, not a sign. When we all get to heaven, what a day of rejoicing that will be. When we all see Jesus, we'll sing and shout the victory. Let us then be true and faithful, trusting, serving every day. Just one glimpse.
So we are in Genesis. We have picked up the story of Abraham, and Abraham began his story in Ur. He travels approximately 650 miles up the river to Haran. When God called him, he travels from Haran to Canaan, which is another 450 miles. And then from Canaan to Egypt, which is approximately 250 miles. And so somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,450 to 1,500 miles, Abraham has traveled from the beginning of this journey to the end. That's a lot of traveling, especially the way that they traveled. It took a lot of time. You can't move fast. You've got animals, you've got people, you've got issues, you've got things that happen. You've got to set up camps. You've got to make corrals for the animals. You've got to do lots of stuff. And so you travel certain distances, but the days are shortened because part of the morning is spent packing up and getting ready to go. And then the end of the day is spent making a new camp. So this is not easy. And we need to understand that. We're talking about the modern nations of Iraq and Syria and Israel and Egypt in all of this traveling. And then this, of course, is just an overview map that we're using as our base map as we study these things. Tonight we are in this section right here from chapter 14. This covers, well, basically a war and a kidnapping and a rescue and lots of other stuff along those lines. And so that's what we're looking at. Chapter 14 begins, it came about in the days of Amraphel, king of Shinar, and Arioch, king of Elasar, and Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, and Tidal, king of Goim, that they made war with Ber, king of Sodom, and with Birsha, king of Gomorrah. Now, I had a cool map that had where these four kings were from. It looked really, really good. Problem is no one really knows for certain where these places are. And so I felt a little weird putting something that was just speculative. But I will tell you, generally, it's believed that these were the nations of the Hittites, and some of those places, part of this would later become Assyria, and this was all north of Haran and kind of into the area that we would call Asia Minor later, and over going east towards Russia. That area just north of the Middle East. And so that's generally where they're believed to have been. So these four kings kind of form an alliance, and they go down to do war against Sodom and Gomorrah. 12 years they had served Chedorlaomer, but the 13th year they had rebelled. In the 14th year, Chedorlaomer and the kings that were with him came and defeated the Rephaim and the Ashtaroth Kinim and Zuzim and Ham and Imam and Sheva Kirithim. Love these names. And the Horites and their Mount Seir as far as El Paran, which is by the wilderness. Then they turned back and came to En Misphit, that is Kadesh, and they conquered all the country of the Amalekites and also the Amorites who lived in Hazazon Tamar. And the king of Sodom and the king of Gomorrah and the king of Admah and the king of Zeboim and the king of Bela, that is Zoar, came out, and they arrayed for battle against them in the valley of Siddim. So we got 5 kings that band together to try to put a stop to this march. It picks up in verse 10, and the valley of Siddim was full of tar pits, and the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled. They fell into them. But those who survived fled to the hill country. Then they took all the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah, all their food supply, and they departed. So they just kind of sacked the city. Anything that had any value to them, they took, and they left. They also took Lot, Abraham's nephew, and his possessions, and departed, for he was living in Sodom. And you'll remember that's kind of where we were at the end of the study last week. There was some animosity between Abraham and his servants and Lot and his servants. And he says, look, this is a big land. Lot, choose where you want to go. And he sees this beautiful valley, and he says, I'm going there. and he chose to settle in Sodom. Well, Sodom ends up in a war. And so if we talk about some of the price that Lot pays for his choice, he got to experience this war. He got to experience being kidnapped. He, according to 2 Peter chapter 2, lived in oppression and torment day after day in the city of Sodom because of the wickedness that was around him. It was torturous to him because, why was it so torturous to him? He was a righteous man. And so here was this righteous man in the middle of this city that was just living in debauchery, and it was torturous to him. He ends up losing all of his material wealth. And not just here, although he probably lost some here too. He ends up losing it all when God judges Sodom and Gomorrah, that we'll read about when we get to chapter 19. And then he endures the shame of the incest with his daughters, and we'll talk about that at the appropriate time as well. All of these things are things that he experienced because of that one choice, which seemed to be a good choice at the time. And again, this is a righteous man, and he's looking out for his family, and he's looking out for his well-being, and this is a better place to pasture his sheep. It's promising to be more prosperous to him. That's where he chooses to go, and just when it rains, it pours. And we talked a little bit at the end last time about the fact that God does not shelter us from all of the consequences of our decisions. God offers us hope and a way out from our sins, but he doesn't shelter us from all the consequences. And Lot and his family dealt with a lot of consequences. So that's where we're at. They take Lot. Then a fugitive came and told Abram, the Hebrew. By the way, this is the first time the term Hebrew is used in the Bible. Hebrew is a different word than Israelite. Israelite has to do with their connection to who? Israel or Jacob. And as a descendant of Jacob, they were Israelites. Abraham, it's relatively, well, I'll just say it this way. The consensus is the term Hebrew goes all the way back to Eber. If you go back to chapter 11 and you look at the lineage that leads us to Abraham, one of his ancestors is named Eber. It's believed that the term Hebrew is connected to Eber. And so it has an ethnic connection to it. There's also some scholarship that suggests that it was used just generically to talk about nomadic people, which is how he was living at the time. And so both of those things could be at play here in terms of him being referred to as Abram the Hebrew. He was living by the oaks of Mamre, the Amorite brother of Eshcol, and the brother of Aner, and these were the allies with Abram. And when Abram heard that his relative had been taken captive, he led out his trained men, born in his house. Now that's an important phrase. Born in his house, 318, and went in pursuit as far as Dan. I want to talk about that verse for just a minute. What does that phrase, born in his house, suggest? Anybody have any thoughts? Okay, these were the children that were born to his servants. These were not Abraham's children. They were not born of his house. They were born in his house, in his care. They were part of this larger group of... So we've got 318 children. Now, there very likely was more children than that born. There's something else unique in this verse. It says something else about these 318. Not only were they born in his house, but what were they? Trained men. So these were the ones that had been identified and trained as soldiers. Abraham had an army. It was a small army, but it was an army. That's why I keep talking about how big a group we're talking about. And this is just Abraham's house. You have Lot's house added to that. Now, Lot's house was not as big as Abraham's, but it was still big. And so they had been traveling together all that time. There was just a bunch of people. And so he had a lot of servants. And these 318 were young men that had grown up and were mature enough to fight at this point. So they're at least second generation servants of Abraham, and maybe more, I don't know. But they're at least second generation servants of Abraham. They're this army, they go out at Abraham's command and pursue Lot and those that were taken with Lot. As far as Dan, now this is an interesting thing that we need to talk about here. If you look on the map, we're looking at number 7 right here, which is way up here. So he's living down here, and he goes, sends his army all the way up here to Dan. Now, where'd Dan get its name? One of the tribes. In all likelihood, it wasn't Dan yet. Wasn't called Dan yet when this happened. What we have going on here, more than likely, is an anachronism. What an anachronism is when you take something out of its time period, but you use it in that setting. And so in order to help people understand, particularly the Hebrews that would be reading this later, where they're talking about the name that was current and that they were familiar with for the area was used so they would understand. We don't really know what it was called at the time. So that's what's going on, and that's where they were going. And he divided his forces against them by night, he and his servants, and defeated them. So not only did he have an army, but he had what? Listen, 5 city-states had put their armies up against these people, and what happened? They lost. Abraham went with his personal army of 318 men and defeated them. Now, he attacked them by night, and he did some things that were smart, if you look at guerrilla warfare as being fair. But what that tells me is that these men were skilled. They were well-trained. They were very effective at what they did. He defeated them. He pursued them as far as Hobah. And so he gets to them at Dan. He divides his forces. He attacks them. He wins. They flee. He's not even satisfied at that. He chases them to Hobah, which is north of Damascus. He brought back all the goods and also brought back his relative Lot with his possessions, and also the women and the people. Then after his return from the defeat of Chedorlaomer and the kings who were with him, the king of Sodom went out to meet him at the valley of Shaveh, that is the king's valley. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. Now he was a priest of God Most High. All right, so who is Melchizedek? He's a priest of God. He is the king of Salem. What's the king of Salem? It's eventually going to be called Jerusalem. And in fact, the Bible actually calls Jerusalem Salem at one point. I think it's the 110th Psalm. Let's look there real quick, see if I'm right. Yeah. The Lord sends forth from Zion your mighty scepter. Nope, that's the wrong verse. Maybe I'm looking in the wrong place. Oh well, somewhere in one of the Psalms, he talks about the tabernacle of God being in Salem. So that is the city, the original name of the city, before David defeats it and makes it the capital of Israel. This man is the king of Salem, but he is also a priest of God Most High. Now that's significant as well. Is he, well, it's not fair to say, is he a kinsman of Abraham? Because if you go far enough back, the answer to that is yes. But is he a near kinsman of Abraham? No. So what does this show us? There's an important lesson in this. It wasn't just Abraham, and it wasn't just the family of Abraham that was reached out to by God. Why was Abraham reached out to by God? You remember his people back in Chaldea were not followers of the God Most High. They were idolaters. Why does God reach out to Abraham? Because of his faith. And he calls him. And Abraham goes and follows him. Clearly, Abraham's not the only person God's talking to. Melchizedek is a priest. Now, that term priest is interesting as well, because we associate that word with what? Organized religion, particularly the law of Moses. That's a long time away. And under the law of Moses, there was a limitation on who could be priests. Who could be priests? The Levites. That's it. That's the only people that could be priests. And yet here is a non-Levite who is called a priest. Is that significant in the story? Yes. It's extremely significant in the story. We're going to look at that a little bit more. Oh, I know what it was. 110th Psalm in verse 4. I looked at verse 2. It's verse 4. So we're going to look at that and let's just go ahead and read a couple of more verses, and then we'll just kind of flesh out a discussion about Melchizedek and his importance. Okay, Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine, and he was a priest of God Most High. He blessed him and said, "Blessed be Abram of God Most High." So we don't make any mistakes. The same God that Melchizedek serves is the same God that Abram serves, called by the same name here, right? Possessor of heaven and earth, blessed be God Most High, who delivered your enemies into your hand. And he gave him a tenth of all. What's that? Okay, tithe. That is, by definition, what a tithe is a tenth. Now, in this setting, what would we call that gift? Where one king gives to, and even though Abraham didn't have a territory at this point, we have to call Abraham a king. He had a bunch of people under his charge. He had his own army. We'll call him a king. One king goes to another king and gives him a large gift. What do we call that? A tribute, which is designed to do what? Okay, make peace, show respect primarily. And who does the giving? Ordinarily, the weaker party, the one who is subservient to the other. Okay, all that's important. All that's important to the story. I mentioned that he is brought up again in Psalm 110. That is the only other time in the Old Testament Melchizedek is brought up, but he is featured heavily in the book of Hebrews. So flip over to Hebrews with me for a moment. We're going to spend a little bit of time in the book of Hebrews talking about Melchizedek and the importance of this character and why this event that we just read It's only three verses. But it's significant and it's recorded for a reason. So in Hebrews chapter 5 is where we first run into his mention in the book of Hebrews. This is a chapter dealing with the superiority of Christ. And it says, verse 5, so also Christ did not glorify himself so as to become a high priest, but he who said to him, thou art my son, today I've begotten thee, just as he says also in another passage, thou art a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. Okay, what is that all about? Jesus was not a Levite. He couldn't be a priest under the law of Moses. And what the Hebrew writer eventually makes an argument of is there must of necessity have been a change of law. Otherwise, he couldn't have been a priest. His priesthood was different than the Levitical priesthood. Where did he receive his priesthood? From God, just like Melchizedek. When did his priesthood end? Didn't. There was no indication that Melchizedek's priesthood had a limit to it. By the way, under the law, there were limits. You served as a priest for about, 20 years? It wasn't even that long, maybe 15 years you were active. You couldn't start until a certain age. You had to retire at a certain age. It was a very limited run, and then they replaced them. That's not the kind of priesthood that Christ had. And that's not the kind of priesthood that Melchizedek had. And so that's the first reference to it. Down in verse 10, the same context, we'll pick it up in verse 8. Although he was a son, he learned obedience from the things which he suffered, and having been made perfect, he became to all those who obey him the source of eternal salvation, being designated by God as a high priest according to the order of Melchizedek. So twice in this context, it points out that Christ's priesthood is like Melchizedek's priesthood. It's a priesthood separate from the law. It's a priesthood that is granted directly by God to an individual. All right, chapter 6. He comes up in the discussion again. And I'm trying to figure out a good place to start. This is one of those books that has a lot of really long sentences. Let's start in verse 17. In the same way, God, desiring even more to show to the heirs of the promise the unchangeableness of his purpose. Now, it's worth pointing out that the promise there has to do with the promise made to Abraham. The unchangeableness of his purpose, interposed with an oath, in order that by two unchangeable things in which is impossible for God to lie, we may have strong encouragement, we who have fled for refuge, laying hold of the hope set before us. This hope we have is an anchor to the soul, a hope both sure and steadfast, and one which enters within the veil. That's a reference to the temple and the access that we have directly to God. The veil was what separated the holy place from the Holy of Holies. And only the high priest could enter into the Holy of Holies and make propitiation for the sins of people before the presence of God. One that enters within the veil, where Jesus has entered as a forerunner for us, having become a high priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. For this Melchizedek, by the way, terrible chapter break. For this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, who met Abraham as he was returning from the slaughter of the kings and blessed him, to whom also Abraham apportioned a tenth part of all the spoils, was first of all, by the translation of his name, King of righteousness, then also King of Salem, which is King of peace, without father, without mother, without genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, made like the Son of God, he abides priest perpetually. Don't make the mistake of thinking that that's talking about Melchizedek. That's talking about Jesus, and the likeness he has to Melchizedek. That's why we're not given a genealogy of Melchizedek. That's why we don't know who his parents are. That's why we're not told any of the information about Melchizedek that we're told about Abraham, for instance. Because Melchizedek is a shadow of Jesus. Now let's go back and read our story again, because something was said. Well, we stopped actually before verse 21. We need to read verse 21. He gave him a tenth of all, and the king of Sodom said to Abram, give the people to me and take the goods for yourself. And Abram said to the king of Sodom, I swore, well, that's not what I want to read. Melchizedek was a priest of God, and he blessed him. He blessed God, who is most high, delivered the enemies, and he gave him, that last sentence, he gave him a tenth of all. What the argument is being made here that reads, if we're not careful, like who was giving the tithe. That is who gave him the tithe. Somebody mentioned that Melchizedek was the tithe giver. That's actually not what happened. And that's why we need to go to the Hebrew letter where it becomes abundantly clear who gave the tithe. Let's read it again. To whom also Abraham apportioned a tenth part of all the spoils. And so Abraham's just collected all the money and all the food and all the people from these kings that they had been rounding up. He's got all them now. And when he meets Melchizedek, Abraham gives the tithe to Melchizedek. So who does that make the superior in the relationship? Melchizedek. And that's exactly the point that's being made in the book of Hebrews, is Christ's position is like Melchizedek's, which Abraham paid a tithe to, which means that Christ is superior to what? To the law, and that which came from the loins of Abraham. That's the point that's being made. And that's why this story is so important, and why it's important that we kind of pay attention. What translation you read, just out of curiosity? The English Standard, yeah. I'm teaching this out of the New American Standard Bible instead of the English Standard. The English Standard guys wanted to make it more clear and actually put Abraham paid the tithe. So we want to understand that. That's the dynamic that's going on here. When Abraham meets him, he receives a blessing from Melchizedek, and then he pays Melchizedek a tithe. Both of those two things together indicate that Melchizedek is the superior in the relationship. He's the one giving the blessing. Who gives blessings? Okay, God gives blessings. When you go down through the family lineage of things, you have Jacob and Esau. Who gave the blessing? The father. The father gives the blessing to the son. That's the relationship. That's the way it works. The superior in the relationship is the grantor of the blessing. He has a blessing to give and authority to give it. And I would suggest, since I were told in this context that he was a priest of God Most High, actually we're told in almost every context that he's mentioned, but in this particular context, we're told that so that we understand, where did this blessing actually originate? From God. He was acting on behalf of God. And so Abraham gave him a tithe, showed him respect, paid him tribute in response to the blessing. What was set up way back here was that the nation that arose out of Abraham and the law that was given through Moses was never intended to be the superior. It was always inferior to God's eternal plan. Did you notice that language as we read through Hebrews? That God has a singular and a consistent purpose. That purpose runs parallel with the priesthood of Melchizedek, not the priesthood from the law. That's also an argument that's made about the promise made to Abraham before the nation promise in your seed all nations will be blessed, that's a superior promise. Then I'll make a great nation out of you, which was a separate thing. So we need to understand that even way back here in Genesis, all the foundation work and groundwork's being laid to let people know that God has something going on up here. Not just this. And so that's what's happened here. The king of Sodom said to Abram, give the people to me and take the goods for yourself. And Abram said to the king of Sodom, I have sworn to the Lord God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, that I will not take a thread or a sandal thong or anything that is yours, lest you should say, I have made Abraham rich. And so when he gets back, okay, Abram's gone out and rescued Sodom. Got his people back, got his stuff back, goes back, and the guys, I guess, wanted to be nice. Okay, look, just give me the people back and you can keep all the stuff. And Abraham said, oh, no, I promised to God that I wasn't keeping anything. Not even a strap of leather to use as a thong on my sandal. Every bit of it goes back to you because I do not want you saying, I made Abraham rich. I will take nothing except what the young men have eaten. His soldiers had already eaten some of the food that they got back. And the share of the men who went with me, Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre, let them take their share. In other words, Abraham says, look, I don't want any of it. Everybody have your stuff back. Everybody have your people back. All I'm going to take out of this deal is the food that my servants have already eaten. And you see the very high standards by which Abraham lived by. There is a very, very old adage among men. To the victor belongs the spoils. Along human thinking, Abraham would have said what to the king of to the king of Sodom? It's all mine. What do you mean? You'll take back? I'm the one that went and got them. He could have argued that he was king. He was now in control. He didn't do that. Not with any of these people. He said, look, y'all take your stuff back. Why did he go, by the way? To rescue Lot. That's why he went. And that's the kind of man he was, and the kind of character that he had, and the level of righteousness that he lived by. He wasn't trying to enrich himself off of the situation. He wasn't trying to empower himself off of the situation. In fact, what he's kind of sort of saying, I think, at least it's implied here, is that he was blessed by God, not by the king of Sodom. I don't want you saying that you've made me. God made me who I am. And so that is the significance. The most significant part of chapter 14 is the introduction of Melchizedek and that interchange. The whole story of the war and Lot and his rescue is simply to set up a reason for this interchange. It would make no sense at all if we just had those 3 verses stuck in there in the middle of nowhere and it didn't explain why that even happened or what the blessing was about. So all that was to set up that one thing, which then becomes a foundational point in the book of Hebrews for understanding the superiority of Jesus and his covenant over the law. To understand that his priesthood is different. The high priest changed often. The sacrifices happened yearly. Jesus is perpetually the high priest, and he offered a sacrifice once for all. A different kind of priesthood completely. And a superior priesthood, as we find going all the way back to Genesis 14, where Abraham understood that Melchizedek, as the priest of God, deserved his respect. Was Abraham a priest? No. Melchizedek was. And by the way, this is just kind of fun to shadow it. How did the priests under the law, how did they get their living? From the tithe that was paid to the temple. How did this priest of God get his wealth, at least in this interchange, from the offering made by the servant of God to the priest of God? And so that relationship is also very old and very much predates the law of Moses. So anybody have any questions or comments? I don't want to get into any more of chapter 15 because it kind of is a whole other story and we don't have time to cover it all.
What was the other verses in Hebrews? I got chapter 5 through 10, but what was it, chapter 6?
Well, it starts in the very end of chapter 6 and goes into chapter 7. It's really most of chapter 7, but specifically, and I'll hit them real quick. If I can get back, you know what? It'd be easier to find it than one that don't have 7,000 pieces of paper in it. Chapter 7, verse 1, then again down in verses 10 and 11, for he was still in loincloths as an ancestor when Melchizedek met him. Now, if perfection had been attainable through the Levitical priesthood, for under the people who received the law, we further needed would have been for another priest to arise after the order of Melchizedek, rather than the one named in the order of Aaron. And so there it makes the point that if the Levitical priesthood was sufficient, there wouldn't be a need for another Melchizedekian priest. And then you keep on reading down in verse 15, he comes up again. This becomes even more evident when another priest arises in the likeness of Melchizedek. And then finally in verse 17, for it is witnessed of him, you are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. And so specifically, he's mentioned in verse 1, verses 10 and 11, verse 15, and verse 17 of chapter 7. But really the whole chapter is being built around that relationship and that event. You're welcome. And Melchizedek was not an alien, and he wasn't supernatural, and he wasn't born without parents. We just don't know anything about his lineage. His priesthood wasn't derived from lineage. The Jewish priesthood under the law was derived from who your father was. The Melchizedekian priesthood was not. And that's the point that's being made there. And there was no limit set on it. He was a priest as long as he lived. And so is Jesus. And how long is Jesus going to live? He reigns forever. So, all right, thanks.
I am weak, but thou art strong. Jesus, keep me from all wrong. I'll be satisfied as long as I walk, dear Lord, close to thee. Just a closer walk with thee. Grant it, Jesus, is my plea.